Hi, this is Travis with another video for you guys over here at Exercise Lab. I'm a doctor of physical therapy for those of you that don't know me. And so now I've uploaded quite a bit of content on this channel related to exercise, at home during the pandemic. Now getting more into gyms. I'm in a garage gym here, a commercial gym, and I've also peppered in quite a bit of rehab related content. Today, I want to bring you guys a little bit of an unconventional video. I did this a few videos back with a posture video where I gave a little more of a podcast style, almost discussion. I'm going to do that today. I'm going to give some demonstration as well, but I want to talk to you about 4 pretty cool things. I'm not going to call them hacks because I don't want to mislead anybody into thinking you're going to get around the hard work. When it comes to developing a good physique, a high level of fitness, there is no getting around the hard work, I'm afraid. But there are some ways you can enhance your efforts. And so today I want to talk to you about some fairly unconventional ways to do that. So some of you might have heard about some of this stuff before. As always, I always try to, pretty much pepper in all the research I can and use that to kind of bolster the stuff I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to do that today as well without getting too deep into the weeds. I'm going to actually upload a separate video just on one of the topics I'm going to talk about today, and I'll be mentioning that at the end of the video. But for now, for those of you who want to learn what these 4 things are, go ahead and stay tuned, and we'll get started. All right, so the first thing I'm going to talk about, I'm going to kind of go in order of what I think is probably less to more important. So the least important, but something that has shown some decent research, I would say it's a little bit equivocal, meaning it kind of goes back and forth. But when it comes to power and strength production, using a mouth guard seems to potentially increase, that force generation. And so when you look at the research, it's going to sort of go back and forth a little bit. There are some studies that show that, this has helped a little bit, particularly when it comes to a custom mouth guard. Now, this is just an off-the-shelf one. You can get these Amazon, all kinds of places. You can get some that range from like to the $10 range. Obviously, if you walk into a dentist's office and try to get a custom, it's probably going to go somewhere into the, several $100 range. I talked to someone not too long ago that went to Turkey and they got a custom one at a dentist office for like 30 bucks. So if you find yourself going to a country like that, maybe you can score one of these cheaper. I don't necessarily know that you need to get a custom one though. I think if you get a well-fitting one, some of these you basically just dunk them in hot water and basically then you bite down on them to kind of mold to your bite. And the idea with these is that your temporomandibular posture, kind of that resting position of the mouth is a little bit enhanced. And when you're really needing a lot of force generation, most people aren't thinking about what their head and neck is doing. They're not really thinking a lot about what their jaw is doing. They might be clenching, but they might be doing it in a way that's a little bit suboptimal. So this basically just kind of gives you something to bite down on, almost like if you'd bite down on something if you were in pain. And so there may be some increased force generation more from that, neural drive perspective, as it's called. And so, if I'm, say if I'm doing a heavy bench press and I really need maximum force, if I can keep my head in good alignment, I can keep my jaw in good alignment. And so I can just kind of really get everything sequencing on the same page, because for those of you who've bench pressed before, if you get a bad start, if you get a bad line, you're kind of out of the rhythm a little bit, that can really make the difference between a lift that you get and a lift you don't get. And so this might be a tool you can use to enhance that. And so one of the reasons I think maybe the research hasn't been able to show as good of a effect size, as big of a difference between the 2 groups. So let's just say hypothetically, I take one group and I put these things in their mouth. I take another group that doesn't have it, and I maybe follow them over a period of time, watching their exercises, and at the end I say how big of a change was there. One of the reasons I might not see a difference is because the people I've just given this to, they're not really that familiar with it. They haven't used it that long. And so it might be that it might take a little more time to capture that difference when you're using these, because when you're thinking about strength, it really is a skill, right? And so you really have to refine it. And so if you're just getting used to this, you're just starting with one of these, you may not get to a point where you're really getting that benefit yet. And so that's, again, just my 2 cents. That's kind of anecdotal. I've used these with some success. I will say I don't necessarily use it all the time. For me, strength acquisition is not my highest priority. The way I train personally is for kind of a combination of strength and hypertrophy. I'm sort of towing the line between trying to get the best of both worlds. I'm not necessarily all in one or the other. And so, but if I was really trying to bring up a lift and I really wanted to try to maximize just my strength, I think adding in one of these could be helpful. And there have been some times where, say if I am trying to, really crank out some extra reps on some heavy loads, I've used one of these and I do feel like they can help a little bit. This is a newer one that I just got, so I don't know how well this one works particularly because, eventually you do have to kind of change them out if you're really biting down on these. But all that being said, this is a mouth guard, so you can give this a try, see if it helps you. All right, so second thing I want to say, I don't really have a lot to demonstrate here. I guess we could listen to something, but music actually. So there is some research that shows that listening to music can actually increase, again, strength. It can increase performance a little bit. Not so much during sports and gameplay, but more for gym type exercise. So whether you're trying to increase hypertrophy, whether you're trying to increase strength, if you're listening to music, and again, music that you like seems to be the punchline, it does seem to help a little bit. There's no shortage of gyms that tend to play music kind of loud. maybe having it a little bit louder. I've certainly noticed anecdotally that when I listen to music a little bit on the louder side, music that kind of amps me up. For me, I like to listen to, something like Kiss, and that seems to help, but again, for somebody else, it might be listening to, Donna Summers. I don't know. But whatever it is, listening to music does seem to help. That's just a really short, quick, and easy hack. So if you're in the gym and you're listening to some music you really hate, get some earbuds, sync it up to your smartphone. It's so easy these days. You don't even have to have an iPod anymore like people used to, Walkmans back in the day. So just, put some earbuds in, you can kind of tune out. I think sometimes it definitely helps me to get in the zone. Sometimes if I'm kind of dragging during a workout, I'm just kind of sitting around and I'm kind of dreading the next set. Like, I don't really feel like I'm going to be able to, hit my numbers, which I try not to do anyways, because if you already go into a set thinking you're not going to do it, you're definitely going to be psyching yourself out of it. So to get in that headspace where I'm like, yeah, I'm ready to do this. I'm ready to hit that number. I'm ready to try to exceed what I did last time, whatever it is. If I have a good song on, a song I'm really liking that's getting me pumped up, it definitely makes a difference. And there have been many times I've been able to hit some numbers I probably wouldn't have hit otherwise if I didn't have that music on. So there's music for the win. All right, so the next one I want to talk to you guys about is what we call palmar cooling, all right, which is basically just a fancy way of saying cooling your hands down. Now, we can get into the weeds pretty deep on this. I'm not going to get super deep into it, but the idea is that basically in the palms, also in the soles of the feet and in certain places in the face, we sort of have these portals, basically, is an easy way to think about it. And I want to keep this simple for those of you that aren't, super nerdy, but I don't want to alienate the nerdy ones either. And so we have these arterial venous, which just basically means artery and vein, anastomosis, which is basically just a channel, right? And so some of you who are in the medical field might know about arterial venous malformations, and that's a bad thing. Those can be fatal, so that's a different problem. Arterial venous anastomosis basically is just a channel between an artery and a vein, and we have these locations in our body which basically are these venous portals. And so these venous portals allow us to essentially bypass the capillaries a little bit. Capillaries are just these really small vessels. And the whole punchline of all this is basically thermal regulation. And so on a hot day, you don't perform as well if you've ever done athletics before, or if you're just working out, in a garage gym and it's really hot and you don't have air conditioning, you can definitely tell there's a decrement in your performance, right? And so one of the reasons why is because your core temperature is probably starting to rise, and your body doesn't like that to happen, right? So your body will try to keep your temperature in a pretty tight window, just like your blood sugar and a lot of other things. That, there's all these different feedback loops that try to keep things at pretty much this steady state. And so if your temperature is really rising, certain metabolic processes are just not as efficient. You're not going to be able to bring as much to the table from an exercise standpoint. And heat is definitely correlated with fatigue. So by cooling your palms down, it's kind of a way of just think about it as more quickly cooling down your core temperature so that you can basically bring more performance to the table, right? So whether it's strength, whether again, I'm trying to last a little longer with hypertrophy, and some of the studies are actually fairly robust when it comes to looking at what these things can do for you. So, when it comes to fending off fatigue, I actually think it's a pretty good strategy. And especially you're going to probably notice an even bigger difference when it's hot. So I would encourage people to use, palmar cooling. Now, the only problem with that is when it gets into commercial gyms, I'll talk actually a moment about the parameters for this in just a second. But in commercial gyms, it does get a little cumbersome, right? So I'm pretty fortunate. I'm in a garage gym. I've got an ice box here, so I can keep things in it that are cool. Now, the thing is, and one caveat I should mention is, if something is super cold, right, that does cause a little bit of what we call vasoconstriction. That may not be quite as helpful, right? So you don't necessarily want to have something freezing cold to where like you get that stinging kind of feeling. And so some of the studies that were done, I think they had, subjects basically cool their palms in between a set for like 3 minutes, and it might have been like 60 degrees or something like that. I think those protocols are going to evolve over time. I don't necessarily know that that's going to be the end all be all. So I really think the punchline is just try to cool your palms down. And I think it takes a lot of self-experimentation. So depending on what you have access to, some things might be a little colder than others. So if I had something and the only thing I had was like an ice pack that's going to be really cold, then I would think you're probably not going to want to hold it as long, or maybe pass it between your hands, or even just kind of rub your hands on it. You don't want to necessarily, again, get to that point where you're really stinging and super cold, but just enough to where you feel like, you're kind of cooling down. Sometimes even just putting my palms in front of a fan, if you have access to one of those, could be a cheap man's way to do it. I've heard people say, grabbing a soda can and kind of passing that back and forth if it's cold. A lot of vehicles to do this. I'm sure there are manufacturers, and there's probably going to be more on the rise soon, that are going to make devices for this. And again, they're going to tell you it stays at a certain temperature. How critical those are going to be, I can't really say. But what I will say is palmar cooling does seem to help. So once again, if you're looking to get the edge, in other words, if you're looking to extend the sets, if you're looking to do a little more volume in a workout, which again we know is associated with good things like more muscle size, potentially even more strength at a heavy load, and I can crank out an extra rep because I'm not as tired, that's going to probably translate again to more strength, more hypertrophy, the kind of things we're after. So palmar cooling, again, pretty good amount of research behind it. It is pretty new, so I won't say it has a lot of research behind it, but the research that is behind it looks pretty promising. So Palmer cooling for the win. This is going to be only behind one other thing, which I'm going to talk about right now. Okay, so the last one and the one for the win, as far as how much I think theoretical backing it has, also the research that has behind it, is going to be BFR, blood flow restriction, and then training is obviously added to the end, although BFR is the acronym. And so basically this is a really cool strategy. It's been around for a little while actually, and I think a lot of the literature started in Japan. It's been, I think they've researched this for over 20 years now. It's definitely caught on, I think, probably more significantly in the fitness and now in the rehab, communities, probably in the last few years. And so I've been, been implementing this now for the last few years as well. I actually kind of got more excited about it during the pandemic because I was just using bands and I knew I wasn't using quite as much resistance as I had been, and so I wanted some ways to kind of get a little bit more out of less resistance. And so BFR is actually kind of a cool way to do that. So BFR is going to probably not help as much when it comes to the acquisition of strength, although it might a little bit. Where it's probably going to really shine the most is with hypertrophy. And again, hypertrophy is just a fancy way of saying increasing muscle size, right? And so the way that it does that, so for those of you who've exercised before and you've gotten a pump, where you kind of really get the blood flowing, and we call that cell swelling, you kind of look bigger and more muscular and you see your veins when you've been working out. This is kind of a way to enhance that process. And so the idea is by, restricting, you're not occluding. So occluding is basically like a blood pressure cuff. When you plug that in, if you're using an automatic cuff, for instance, it's going to go all the way up to where you're fully occluded. And so it's going to have you at like 160, maybe 200 millimeters of mercury. And then it's going to slowly be releasing that blood back. And then that's how it measures your blood pressure. Typically with BFR, you're not going to go up that high. And so you're going to be just kind of restricting the blood flow a little bit, not fully occluding it. And so obviously you don't want to cause ischemia, which is basically where you're causing a situation where tissue isn't getting any oxygen, and so it can actually die off, and that's a bad thing, like cardiac ischemia. And so what we're talking about here, though, is something that's much tamer than that. The research has actually shown it's fairly safe. People that are worried about blood clots, actually, there doesn't seem to be much of an increased risk with BFR and blood clotting. Now, that being said, if you have a history of a blood clotting condition, if you have a history of strokes, if you have a history of having altered ejection fractions and a weak heart, you definitely want to probably get checked out before you do any of this stuff. So those are a lot of caveats there. Any type of a cardiac history you're worried about, I would probably just run that by your cardiologist, make sure all is well. You may be increasing your blood pressure temporarily a little bit with these. Anytime you're restricting the limbs or restricting your torso, you can increase blood pressure. So the BFR bands probably do that to a degree. But all considered, it seems to be fairly safe. How much more dangerous it is than just doing a conventional type of workout, the jury's out on that. Probably not a lot though. But what I will say, from those of you who aren't so much worried about the safety aspects and are just ready to do this and get into the performance aspects, is that it definitely does seem to help with the muscle hypertrophy because you're basically keeping the metabolites. And so again, a lot of that cell signaling that happens that sort of tells your body to, okay, hey, this guy needs to adapt and get stronger. You're leaving them in the area longer by putting this on. And so I'll just show you, for instance, if I were to, these straps here are not as specific, but I've used them long enough and I've compared them to my pneumatics that I kind of know what amount of occlusion that I like. What a lot of the research shows with these two is you probably only want to go about 30 minutes on these. And when you're first starting out, I'd probably go even less. You might even want to go like 5, 10, 15 minutes when you're just getting started. I probably wouldn't, you don't want to cinch this down super tight. You'll definitely fatigue a little faster when you're using BFR too. So you don't want to necessarily use real heavy loads. So again, if you're looking for strength and you're doing 80% of your 1 rep max or above that, this may not be your best tool. I typically am using a little bit of a lighter load, or I'm going towards the end of my workout when I'm already fatigued and I'm kind of doing more of those burnouts or pump sets, and I'm just looking to get a little more extra. I'll throw these BFR bands on. So for me, if I'm doing a workout that's maybe an hour, I'll probably throw these on, no more than the midpoint. Sometimes I'll even go to kind of 3/4 of my workout before I'll throw these on and kind of pepper in some BFR at the end. Once I put them on though, I try to leave them on. So again, I'm taking advantage of that restrictive effect and leaving those metabolites in that area, in that vicinity a little bit longer. And so then I'm doing my workout, and again, that would be more on a hypertrophy day. And you definitely get a better pump with these. We know cell swelling is also kind of a growth factor that sort of helps with muscle hypertrophy. So BFR actually has some pretty good theoretical backing, and it's a pretty easy thing to implement. Most of these bands, so again, this is just a really cheap style that I got. I think I actually might have got these on Amazon. It's just a basic strap. There's really nothing fancy here at all. And I think these are like 10 or 15 bucks. So this is very cheap. They do have some more, sophisticated kinds that actually almost like a blood pressure cuff will tell you how many millimeters of mercury you're occluding. And, there's apps that'll sync to on your cell phone. And I'm going to talk to you about one that I like a lot as soon as I can get that video up. But again, BFR band's definitely a big win in my book. I'd encourage you guys to try it for any of you looking to increase muscle size. the limbs, obviously the leg works out pretty well for as well. So that's the BFR band. All right, so those were basically the 4 things. So just to review, we talked about a mouth guard, which, again, has a little literature behind it, but it's kind of equivocal. But there may be some benefit when it comes to just pure strength and power acquisition, basically just trying to really move those heavy loads and increase that neural drive. Mouth guards can possibly help. We had music, which I think can pretty much help just across the board. I think that will probably help when it comes to aerobic events as well. If you're in a good song you like, obviously that's why spin classes listen to music, because people push themselves a little harder. Probably go a little longer because you're more distracted by the music than thinking about what your body's doing and how much you want to quit, or what you're having for dinner and all that stuff. So I think music definitely can help, particularly again when music is specific to you. So if it's a song you like, probably if you're listening to it now, again, I don't want to be guilty of anybody's losing their hearing, so you don't want to listen to stuff super loud. But if you can do it in small doses, maybe right before you're gonna crank out a heavy set, you turn it up a little bit and then obviously come back down in between sets, because you probably want to relax your system in between sets anyways, right before you're gonna get into the next set. So music was number 2. Number 3 we talked about was the Palmar cooling, just cooling down that core temperature, basically fending off fatigue a little longer to extend your sets, extend your workout a little bit. And then the last thing we talked about was BFR, which again, I'm going to upload another video where I'm going to get a little more into the weeds on what it is and kind of how to implement it. But I want to just kind of at least touch on it for today, and I've kind of alluded to it in some other videos. So there it is. Last thing I want to say, and again, I'm just going to throw this out there. I always like to give a bonus if I can at the end of a video. Flexing in between sets. Now, the way that seems to work is it increases your mind-muscle connection, and it seems to particularly help with a muscle that you don't necessarily have a great mind-muscle connection to. So a lot of people, for instance, have a hard time activating their back muscles when they're doing a big compound movement like, say, a pull-up. And so when it comes to strength, you don't always want to think about muscles. Sometimes you want to think about movements, right? So if I'm doing a pull-up and I can barely do one, I don't want to probably be thinking about my lats. I want to be just thinking about how I can efficiently get to the top. Once you get to a point, though, where you're doing pull-ups pretty comfortably, say you can do more than 10, and you want to increase your back recruitment because you don't really feel it a lot in your back, maybe you feel it mostly in your arms. If you think about that muscle, it actually can increase the recruitment of that muscle as you're doing that exercise. And you can take that one step further now. And if you think about working that muscle in between the exercises, pretty much kind of flexing and tensing your lats, and you can kind of experiment with how you would do that. A bicep is an easy one to think about because, most people can flex their biceps pretty well because we all bring food to our mouths and we're just very in tune with that muscle. But if you think about flexing a muscle in between the workout, it seems to actually maybe be able to increase the recruitment of that muscle, which in theory would also probably increase hypertrophy. So when it comes to strength, that's again where your focus wants to be more external, more on moving the weights, for instance, if I'm doing a bench press. Whereas when it comes to hypertrophy, I don't really care so much about the weight. I mean, obviously I want to get it off my chest because I don't want it to crush me. But assuming I can do that, I'm probably using a little bit of a lighter weight, and I'm thinking more about flexing my chest as I'm doing it. And then maybe even between sets, I might be thinking about doing something where I'm kind of flexing those pec muscles. And if I were to do that, I might be able to increase the recruitment of that muscle. Then I do another set and I can really dial it in on those pecs. And again, that's a strategy bodybuilders have been using for a long time. Bodybuilders like Jay Cutler talks about how he really gets his mind in the muscles when he's doing exercises. And, there's obviously things you can say about those guys, but I think they've got it right when it comes to mind-muscle connection. And it definitely does seem to help, and it does have some backing with regard to the literature. So the one caveat to that, though, is if you're trying to increase performance, if you're trying to increase strength, you probably don't want to use that strategy because it is going to create some muscle fatigue to where then you could do that second set and then you're going to be a little bit more worn out for it. You're not going to have that performance. So say if I were doing a strength training session, but I also wanted to pepper in some hypertrophy at the end, that might be a good time to implement it. But I wouldn't do it on those sets where you're really maxing out, trying to go heavy, trying to hit a new PR, hit some new numbers, because it is going to be a performance decrement on those exercises from strength perspective. So all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this content today. Once again, let me know if you like this more discussion style. I know I had a little bit of a demonstration, but not really today. But I wanted to just bring you guys some stuff I thought was, somewhat exciting. Some different strategies I've even used in my own training. I just hadn't had a chance to talk about yet. So once again, let me know what you guys want to see. I've got some good content to come. I'm going to be talking about some 3D bands and kind of how I like to incorporate some rotational strength. And I found them to be really helpful. And then I've got a BFR band coming soon and hopefully some other good stuff too. But again, any special requests, let me know. Subscribe if you like this stuff. And as always, I hope you guys have some fun.